Everybody there now? Good. It's going to benefit you to write good, full answers. Mr. Hava and I will be able to see your answers. It's not for credit, but it is for practical experiences of us getting through this lecture and understanding things. Yeah?
Are we doing this now?
You'll do it. You'll see the questions that are presented inside the lecture. So it's the normal way that we do our lecture, but instead of just writing your answers in your note, you'll write them in the quiz, and then they'll be documented permanently for visibility to everyone. All right, I'm ready to go here. Here are the learning objectives for what we're going to talk about today. And I talked about this a little bit with my classes, but for everybody, one of the things about this unit, it's kind of cobbled together across different parts of our text. Module 6 on the movement of energy and Module 7 on the movement of matter are very dense modules. Everything in there, it's already been distilled down. It's very important. There's a lot of key terms to define. You have to know what assimilation, nitrification, denitrification. You have to know the processes associated that cause the phosphorus cycle to work, all of those things. There's a lot of going on there. And so what's misleading about the way that this is set up is the real estate dedicated to talking about the biomes by the authors of our text is like 5 times as much literature written as there is for those other two. Those other two are much more important than these, but they describe in full all of these ecosystems in case you've never seen them. I assume everybody's seen a lot of pictures in their life, so there's not very much that's unfamiliar to you, but there's a few key things that we care about a lot, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about them in our lecture now. So what I want you to get out of our lecture today is understanding what are the limiting factors and how do those contribute to the makeup of a biome, but we're going to cover all these things along the way. So here we go. This is the definition for the biomes, and we have 2 different categories for the biomes. Terrestrial biomes, which we spend most of our time talking about, and then the aquatic biomes. The difference between the two is it's as simple as it can be. One is on land, and one is on water. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the end making sure that we do our due diligence to talk about aquatic biomes, because we haven't spent very much of our class time looking at those yet today, or yet in this class, so we'll kind of intro that today. I really like this graphic, which actually comes from an associated text for AP Biology, but it's really good because it shows some of the things that really matter in terms of temperature inputs and amount of precipitation and how all the biomes break up. So it's just a really nice graphic. But these 2 things are key to have in our mind. This list of the biomes, everybody's going to be tempted to frantically write all these down. They're in the text. There are 9 terrestrial biomes. There are 3 freshwater aquatic biomes and 5 marine aquatic biomes. We're going to look at these, but we're not going to talk about each one of them specifically. But all of these have a different makeup. They all look slightly different, and we want to understand, well, why do they look different? How does the level of productivity contribute to the makeup of these biomes? So I'm not going to stay on this slide for very long because we're not going to go over, well, the definition of an Arctic tundra is this. Well, that's not what we're interested in. We're looking at it in a more practical and applicable sense. So let me jump back. This image is not new to us. We saw this when I lectured on the first part of this section of our content that we're in right now, and we talked about assigning relative latitudes to each one of these. So this is the terrestrial biomes. It's the same list you just saw, and then here are all the aquatic ecosystems. Again, that same list you just saw, and the value axis here is associated with the amount of primary productivity. So we said, well, what latitudes do you think you would find all of these biomes at? How does that relate to primary productivity? Now what I want you to do is, this is in Canvas, so you're going to list all of the climatological factors that you can think of that relate to understanding, well, how do they influence the productivity? The black seems a little hard to read in here, but of the Arctic tundra, and then of the temperate grasslands. So here's the data, but I just want to show this, because the global image helps us understand it a little bit better. So the Arctic tundra is up here at the top, and then the grasslands, there are some here, and there are also some here. You'll notice those are about the same relative latitude, so you can talk about either one. But list all of the factors that you can think of. We'll go for only about 1 minute on this exercise. answers go in Canvas again. See the same question from the slide in the practice quiz.
Is there any chance we can go back and see the precipitation levels?
It wasn't on the graph. It just said primary productivity. There are only a few factors, and then there are some that really matter a lot. I like what Catherine's question was. She said, well, can we go back to the graph and see what the precipitation levels, that actually wasn't shown on the graph. But let's talk about what came out as a large group here for number one. What are the climatological factors that would contribute? We've talked a lot about all the climatological drivers that exist. Which ones matter? Yeah.
Precipitation.
So precipitation probably matters a lot, but how do we figure out climatologically where a lot of precipitation occurs? The latitude matters a lot. Why does the latitude matter first for precipitation? So let's just stay here with precipitation box. Why does the latitude matter a lot?
Because at certain latitudes, they get more precipitation. So if you at the Hadley cells at 30 degrees.
Very good. Let me just stop it there because that's really good, and I want to make sure everybody's caught up. So she says, well, the latitude really matters because it tells us where these convection cycle boundaries are, and the convection cycle drives what kind of precipitation. So at these areas that are about 23 degrees north, what type of precipitation would we expect there? At about 23 to somewhere in about 20 to 30 degrees latitude on each respective side of the equator. Lots of precipitation or no?
Yeah. Medium to high.
I hear both answers, yes and no. Where would be the most precipitation? At the equator, and then the boundary of the Hadley cell, which Maria brought up, where is that? It's about right here, and it's about right here. So these areas where it's really wet or not very wet. There's not as much precipitation because of the convection cycle. So precipitation and latitude and convection, all of those climatological factors, they're all related to one another. What else? What are some other key ones? What else matters? What other climatological factors? The amount of solar insolation, heat energy, and sunlight. So those are two different things. Heat energy corresponds with the amount of temperature, and so we know productivity might be associated with that. We also talked about sunlight energy. So what latitudes would you expect the most sunlight, right? The equator across the whole year, but what about in December, January, February? In the southern hemisphere. So we have some key things that we care about a lot. Here's a graph that shows all of those biomes and they're kind of mapped. And what you see is there are fairly clear boundaries around where each of the biomes are. So you don't have to try to figure out, there's a lot going on in this picture, but what you see is something like this where there's a band of all of this one biome. Well, that's near 30 degrees. It's an area that's fairly dry. The boundaries of the biomes are composed because of the level of productivity and some of these climatological factors. So everything that we've learned about climatological factors really matters for understanding this about biomes. This last fact that I just put on here kind of sums that up. The biomes are categorized by combinations of those key things that you guys just mentioned. Temperature, heat energy, and the amount of precipitation. Here's something, again, that's also not new. These are climatograms that we've seen before. We saw this at the end of our climatological unit. And so I just want to break it down again in case you didn't get it then. Along the category axis is months of the year. And then we have two value axes on the Y side, one on the left and one on the right. One corresponds with the amount of temperature, and that is associated with heat energy, so it's usually represented in red. That is intuitive. And in a similarly intuitive manner, the amount of precipitation usually goes with one of the axes that is in blue, so that you can see the amount of precipitation that's available there. What I want to point out is this new term, which is limiting factor. So it's some abiotic thing that's going to limit the amount of primary productivity. Primary productivity is the keys to the kingdom on understanding biomes. We'll come back to it again and again and again. So we're looking at the limiting factors of ecosystems, and that is going to be driven by the amount of primary productivity. Here gives a really good example. It says when the precipitation line is below the temperature, plant growth, or primary productivity, is limited in terms of availability of precipitation or water. Why would that be true? Help me make the link there. It says productivity is limited when it's low water, but why? What's the link? Think biogeochemical cycles. Maria? Plants need water to survive, which is about the most brilliantly, simply stated thing that we could use. But why biogeochemical cycle-wise? Oops, sorry. Biogeochemical cycle-wise. What do plants use water for? For photosynthesis. H2O, water is a critical chemical input for photosynthesis to occur. So this is telling us, hey, the amount of sunlight here, which is another critical input for photosynthesis, is fine. We're assuming the amount of carbon dioxide is abundantly available across the entire globe, which is the other input, but the amount of water is too low. They don't have enough of that input. In other words, their productivity is limited by that factor, which is water. So this is one good example here. Does everybody understand climatograms and understand these key things to understand? We're going to do a little bit of practical experience here. But before we get into that, let me give you what the other limiting factors are for terrestrial biomes. So here are some of the ones we've already talked about that are associated with climate and weather: precipitation, heat, energy, or temperature. In areas where it's permanently frozen, the permafrost, no plant productivity can go on. Even though there is water there, it's not bioavailable for the plants to use. Nutrients matter a lot as well. So the other biogeochemical cycles, most notably nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus is a limiting factor. Plants need it to survive. They need it to produce ATP and other macromolecules. They need nitrogen for DNA and all kinds of macromolecules and proteins, amino acids. But soil configuration matters. And when I say soil configuration, what I'm talking about here is favorable physical soil conditions. So it's the right composition of clay, silt, and sand for plants to grow. Does everybody have these? All right, great. Let's do a little bit of experience. So here's something that looks very similar to what we would maybe give on an assessment, interpreting some graphs, a key scientific skill set. So we're going to go through and you're going to answer these questions in a second on your Canvas quiz, and I'm going to give you the time to answer that. But I want to give you this because it's a little hard to read and the graphs are really small. The white boxes correspond with vegetative vigor, and I gave you the definition for what that means. It's associated with plants. So the y-axis here is measuring this thing, which is the amount of vegetative vigor. So that will help you understand the value axis here. The y-axis is a number that's associated with that. We're going to go here for about 2 minutes. I want you to answer both questions. Serves you right. Sit in the back. What I say. Can't see you. vegetative vigor. So it's a number that's associated with that box. Okay, let's look at this together. I'm going to skip number 1, part 1, because hopefully you were able to navigate that really well, but it'll be informing for understanding 2 and 3. This tells you North America and South African, but the South African one, let's just use that as an example. How do you know which hemisphere that's in? If I didn't give you the title of the graph. So we have a few things in the summer. I like a few parts of that. He said there's more vegetative vigor, so there's some key thing about precipitation like we were just talking about. The 3 critical inputs for plant productivity is amount of precipitation, amount of sunlight, and then the temperature probably matters a little bit. And so, what do you think, Maria?
So you would know that this one is the North American tundra because it gets more sunlight.
In which months?
In June through September, and that would be when that area gets more sun.
So there's something about maybe the amount of sunlight that's available in each relative hemisphere. So we can look at the relative areas. Which one of these is more productive between the two? The woodlands, and how do you know? Yeah.
Because it has a higher vegetative vigor.
It has a higher maximum vegetative vigor, for sure. So we see a little bit about the trends, and then we see a little bit, if we understand primary productivity, it should help us understand a little bit about number 2. I have more on this that I want to continue to do. So the next question on your Canvas quiz is this, and you should answer each one, and you should cite specific evidence from the graphs to answer the question. What we're looking at here, I want to point out the graph a little bit to help you understand it. The triangle on the left one, so this is the North American tundra. On the right side is the woodland. Here in the leftmost graph for each one of those respectively, the triangles is surface temperature, and then the black dots on the one on the right side respectively is for the amount of precipitation. So what I want you to do is use the information about vegetative vigor, which is the white box, and the other information, and then tell me about the limiting factor and cite specific evidence from the graph. So we'll go for a few extra minutes on this. We'll go for about 4 minutes total. Oops. Sorry, I got it. Got messed up. Here we go. We're back. let's look at these together. On the first graph, or on the first side, the North American tundra, what do you think is the limiting factor based on the evidence that's given above? When we look at these two graphs, one of these tends to match the trend observed with vegetative vigor more than the other. Which one of them is it? Surface temperature. So the amount of precipitation is fairly good across the year. Of course, we see that when there's more precipitation, the productivity is also increased. But the thing that's driving the ecosystem, or the primary productivity in this case, is the amount of surface temperature, the amount of heat energy. So when it's too cold, when the temperature is below zero, plant productivity is really limited. And we see that this is written, this is the surface temperature here. And so when it's too cold or it's frozen, we know water isn't available, but even without understanding that or knowing the composition, you can look at the evidence and say, well, that makes good sense. What about the other one? This is the African grassland. Which one does it correspond with? The amount of precipitation. So we can see the amount of temperature across the year is pretty favorable for plant growth. It's about 25 degrees, which is similar to what it is today or inside this room even. And so this amount of temperature is fine for the plants, but they're limited in certain times of the year because of the amount of precipitation. So we see the primary production, which is the key thing. If we have a lot of primary producers, then we can have a lot of other levels of the trophic system supported. And so understanding what's driving the primary producers is the major thing that we want to focus on. Any questions on this? Excellent. The next thing I want to do is spend a little time. Let's see if I can get this. Oh, come on. Give it to me. Come on. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. My computer has been on the fritz today. We're back. We've just spent a good amount of time talking about the terrestrial biomes. Some of the trends are going to be the same, but I want to make sure that we talk about the aquatic biomes as well, because there are some key distinctions between the two. There are certain ones, limiting factors, that are shared across terrestrial and aquatic biomes. They're the obvious ones. Well, it's the amount of solar insolation, which corresponds with the amount of energy that is used by primary producers in order to photosynthesize and produce chemical energy. So we've seen that come up a lot. It's temperature. So in areas where it's too cold or it's too warm, you're not going to be able to support primary productive life. So again, those two things are shared. The next thing I want to talk about is the dissolved oxygen. We've just talked about that quite a bit, but the amount of dissolved oxygen, where does that come from in water? Some of it is taken out of the atmosphere, but where is the main place that it probably comes from? What do you think? We just did a whole lab that used dissolved oxygen. Where does oxygen come from? Could be algae, otherwise known as more broadly what kind of thing? They're a type of plant, or otherwise, let's just think about it in the even broader sense, less broad than organism, but primary producers. They're the things that's making all of the energy for the entire ecosystem. So what's interesting is the amount of dissolved oxygen corresponds a lot with the amount of solar insolation and temperature. So we see those things kind of match together quite often. But all organisms need oxygen to survive. We've already looked at how primary producers produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Why do they need oxygen to survive? I'm saying every organism on the planet needs oxygen, and why is that true? Yeah. For cellular respiration. We need oxygen as the final acceptor of electrons in the electron transport chain, which is more than you need to know. But oxygen in the aquatic biomes is hard to come by. In atmospheric terrestrial biomes, it's easier because we can take it from the atmosphere, but in water, we need it. The other two that we care about a lot, nutrient levels was shared with the terrestrial biome, so we discussed that before. What's interesting is it's still at play, and the mechanisms that are at play on the terrestrial side are at play in aquatic, but you usually only see examples on land. But we still need nitrogen for macromolecules and everything in aquatic life. We still need phosphorus as well, so that we have those cycles occurring in water and assimilation and all of that, but it just is underwater. So I want to make sure that we note that as well. And the last one, salinity, which matters less in the ocean but matters a lot in freshwater. Organisms can only tolerate a certain range for concentrations of salt. I'm ready for another exercise here in a second, but before we get there, a couple key terms from the text. We won't spend very much time on this now, but it'll come up a lot again when we look at pollution. But we have certain terms to describe the amount of productivity in aquatic ecosystems. Why do we have specific terms? Because it's the main thing. If you don't leave this lecture with anything else, understand that the composition of biomes is primarily driven by the primary productivity. So this tells us how productive are different levels. And so levels of lakes and ponds have ways to describe. Oligotrophic is a level with extremely low productivity. Mesotrophic means that you have a certain level in the middle, and eutrophic means it's highly productive. This on the left shows just a regular lake, and it shows that you have key zones, and I don't care as much about the names of the zones, but I do want you to know, well, why do you think it's not very productive down here in the profundal zone? Just thinking about limiting factors. Yeah. There's not as much penetration of light.
Lower temperature?
It could be much lower temperature, and usually is. So as we think about the zones of aquatic ecosystems, it's the limiting factors that tells us a lot about the productivity. Here are some key terms. One last slide of key terms that apply to the marine systems. So this shows a marine ecosystem. We have intertidal zones, photic zone, which it's the upper layer and receives a lot of sunlight, meaning a lot of photosynthesis can happen there. The aphotic zone, which is it's a little deeper and has almost no. There's a benthic zone that's not listed on here, which is even less than that, towards the bottom. And then they also mention here, because it's a very interesting thing that occurs on the planet, but chemosynthesis, there are a few ecosystems that are supported by chemical energy exclusively and not photosynthetic energy. And chemosynthesizers are those organisms that do that. And they usually weirdly live at the bottom of the ocean, and they survive on these forms that are released through geothermal processes. So I just wanted to mention that there because it mentions it in the text. The terms come up a little bit now. We're thinking about it more open and applicability-wise now, but these will come back a little bit later. Last exercise for us to think through here, and then we'll kind of close everything and wrap everything together. I've given you two picture images that I feel like are very representative of what I want you to understand for these questions that you'll answer again in Canvas. Here is the coral reef. Here is the open ocean. So I want you to think about just comparing the level of productivity based on the observations that you can make. You can use a little bit of background knowledge, but I want you to focus on what you see. And then the second is, well, now that I see the productivity, what contributes to the difference between the two? Talk about the limiting factors. We'll go here for a few minutes, then we'll talk about it together. to talk through this, just kind of walk through it myself, and then we'll look for a couple answers and see how your answers match what I'm saying here. But in both of these ecosystems, wouldn't you agree that the amount of solar insolation is pretty high? I think this is a picture of somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, probably near the equator. This is at a similar place along the equator. So the limiting factor is probably not the amount of sunlight. It probably isn't the amount of heat energy if they're at the similar area of latitude. And even during times of the year when we have like an El Nino event, the amount of energy in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is fairly high. But as you can see, far less productivity in the open ocean than in the coral reefs. Well, what can explain that? Any ideas?
Dissolved oxygen.
Dissolved oxygen might be part, and that's going to be associated with what sort of thing? Photosynthesis and primary producers. What else?
Technically, wouldn't there be less light in the open ocean depending on your level?
If there would be, great answer, depending on your level. So at the surface level, there's quite a bit of heat energy and there's quite a bit of sunlight. Lower down, there's way less, and we find even fewer organisms there. Yes, what else?
So off of that, open ocean is much deeper.
The open ocean is deeper, and the deeper, the less sunlight in those areas. But even in the top level, right here, this is the surface. Wouldn't you agree there's not much productivity? Yeah. There's shallower water, there's attachment, there's sort of things.
Higher salinity?
The differences in salinity is a little bit slight. Let me go back here just for a second. And if we think about the limiting factors, well, it's maybe not temperature. It could be dissolved oxygen a little bit, but that's associated with plants. Why are there any plants if we have favorable conditions here? It's probably what? The solar insolation in some places is really low, but in other places it's fairly high.
It's the nutrient levels because the runoff from the land brings more nutrients into like the shallower parts, which are near like
the shallower parts, which can support primary productivity. The key thing is, what were you going to say, Bree?
Well, I was going to say, like, it's like the coral and stuff in it, and so, like, that means that they're, like, producing more, like, if they're at, like, the same solar insolation, solar energy, that they are creating more photosynthesis, and the organisms, or like, the primary consumers that are eating, or off of the primary producers, are going to have more energy with their long-term nutrition.
I like that answer, and I'm going to try to summarize it and add a couple of my thoughts here as well. Interestingly, you don't actually see many of the primary producers here, but they are present, but you know that they're present because look at all these layers of the trophic. Look at all these trophic levels you have here. If you have a bunch of other things, you'll probably have a lot of primary production. It's the nutrient levels in this case by process of elimination, but just also the understanding we still have to have cycling of nutrients in the aquatic ecosystems as well. So the open ocean, there's no way for primary producers to survive, thrive without that. You don't have any of the other levels of the trophic levels. The main thing that I want to just, as a final closing thought, provide to you, the makeup of the biomes is driven by the primary producers. I've said it once, I'll say it again right here at the end. So when you think about the biomes and you're trying to understand, and you're trying to picture how it looks, it's the primary producers. Because consumers, if they don't have enough energy in one place, what will they do? They could either die, or what's another option? They can move around and migrate and other sorts of things. So we see that a lot with animals that need a lot of energy like tertiary consumers. So we're going to use the primary producers as going to tell us the makeup of the biomes. Good job today. Make sure you hit submit on your Canvas quiz. If you didn't get that, make sure it gets in. Fabulous day. We'll do a little more work tomorrow and Friday.